Chapter 4 of our lecture notes is about tissues. They call it the living fabric. Tissues are defined as groups of cells similar in structure and function. There are 4 different types or classes of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. Epithelial tissues are distinguished very much by their cellularity. In other words, they're composed almost entirely of cells. They have special contacts with each other. They form continuous sheets held together by tight junctions and desmosomes. They have polarity. They have an apical and basal surface, a top and a bottom, in other words. They're supported by connective tissue, reticular and basal lamina. We'll talk about those later on. Epithelial tissues are avascular, meaning they have no blood vessels and no direct blood supply. But they do have nerve fibers, so they are innervated. That's a term we use for a nerve supply, innervated. They're regenerative and rapidly replace lost cells by cell division, by mitosis. The way we classify epithelia, first of all, is by whether or not they're in layers. Simple is a single layer of cells, and stratified is multiple layers of cells. We can also classify them by shape. We have squamous, which I think of as squashed or flattened cells. Cuboidal, which are rather cube-shaped, and columnar, which are sort of like a column. First, we're going to look at simple squamous epithelium. It's a single layer of flat cells with disc-shaped nuclei and sparse cytoplasm. The functions: diffusion and filtration. And they provide a slick, friction-reducing lining in lymphatic and cardiovascular systems. They're present in the kidney glomeruli, lining of the heart, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and serosa, which are membranes. Here's an example of simple squamous epithelium in the air sacs of the lungs. You'll see here that we have a single layer of cells here, and you can see nuclei along the way in these cells. These are nuclei of the cells all over in here. Now, we don't want to get confused. Later on, we're going to see a slide of adipose tissue, and they're kind of easy to mix up, right? But this is single layers of cells in a line here, all right? This is empty space in the lung. These are air sacs in the lung. Next, we have simple cuboidal tissue, a single layer of cube-like cells with large spherical central nuclei. They function in secretion and absorption. We find them in abundance in kidney tubules, the ducts and secretory portions of small glands, and the ovary surface. So this is a slide from kidney tubule tissue, and this is very characteristic looking. We see these cuboidal cells, a single layer of cuboidal cells lining the kidney tubule. So this is as if we are looking into the tubule, like looking into a garden hose cut in cross section, and the cells make up the rubber outer layer of the garden hose. All right. Now, we also see a couple of these kidney tubules in a longitudinal section like this, and they tend to look a little bit like the tentacles of an octopus when they're in longitudinal section. But this is a very typical look right here. And you can see it's a single layer of cuboidal cells. So this is a single layer of cells right there. Right, and you can see the nuclei interspersed all over the place in here. The white space in the center is the lumen, or the empty tube-like space of the kidney tubule. Simple columnar epithelium, we have a single layer of tall cells with oval nuclei. Many contain cilia, different types contain cilia. Goblet cells are often found in this layer of cells. They function in absorption and secretion, so of course we find them in the digestive tract especially. The non-ciliated type line the digestive tract and the gallbladder. The ciliated type line the small bronchi, the uterine tubes, and some regions of the uterus. Cilia help move substances through internal passageways. In the respiratory system, these ciliated columnar epithelia move mucus across the surface in one direction to sweep the dust and smoke particles out of the bronchi so that it doesn't go down into the lungs. One of the really bad things about smoking, if you need another reason to not smoke, is that it paralyzes these little cilia so that they can't do their job. Simple columnar epithelium, here it is again in an actual microscopic slide of it. You can see they are single column-shaped cells like that. And here's a diagram of the same thing over here. These are the type of cells now that we're going to find in the digestive system. Next, we have pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It's a single layer of cells with different heights. Some do not reach the free surface. The nuclei are seen at different layers. They function in secretion and propulsion of mucus. Many of them are ciliated. They're present in the male sperm carrying ducts, non-ciliated, and in the trachea, ciliated. So here we see pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium right here. It looks like they're in multiple layers. This is why it's called pseudostratified or fake stratified. Right? It looks like there's multiple layers of cells, but in fact we're seeing nuclei that are at different heights in the same layer of cells. And then we're also seeing goblet cells here. And this is a very darkly stained goblet cell. Usually they're going to be pale or even translucent. Right? But goblet cells create mucus that then is released. This is a goblet cell. The mucus is released onto the surface of the cells. And then the cilia here actually sweep that mucus along. Stratified squamous epithelium, it's a thick membrane composed of several layers of cells. They function in protection of underlying areas subjected to abrasion. They form the external part of the skin's epidermis. These are keratinized cells. They have the protein keratin in them. And the linings of the esophagus, the mouth, and the vagina. And these are non-keratinized cells. So these are all areas that are subject to a lot of abrasion and friction, and they have to be able to reproduce this layer of cells on a regular basis. So stratified squamous epithelium looks something like this. We have a layer of cells down here at the bottom that's constantly reproducing. It can be called the basement membrane. It can also be called the stratum germinativum. Now the cells are reproduced down here, and as they mature, they move up towards the surface of the skin. Up in this area, we can see the flattened or squashed look of stratified squamous epithelium. When they get closer to the free edge out in here, we see them, they actually are usually dead by that time, and they are filled with keratin protein. Stratified cuboidal and columnar, we're not going to really spend any time on that. They're pretty rare in the human body, and we don't have them in labs, so we're really not going to talk about them here. The next type of epithelium is transitional. Transitional is a little bit different. It's several cell layers, and the basal cells are cuboidal. The surface cells are dome-shaped. It stretches to permit the distension of the urinary bladder and the ureters. So that's where we find them. Urinary bladder, in the ureters, and part of the urethra. So transitional epithelium has a characteristic scalloped look like this, right? This is the free edge out here, and these cells look a little bit like cuboidal cells, but what happens is as this area here fills with urine, these cells are squashed down and become flattened, and they almost look like they're stratified squamous epithelium at that point, right? But they are actually called transitional epithelia. Glandular epithelia. A gland is one or more cells that makes and secretes an aqueous fluid. They're classified by the site of product released. They're either endocrine or exocrine. The relative number of cells forming the gland. They can be unicellular or multicellular. Endocrine glands are ductless glands that produce hormones, and secretions include amino acids, proteins, glycoproteins, and steroids. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a few slides here because I have an assignment for you to do in the discussion section on Canvas. So take a look there. It's going to be about this glandular tissue. So I'm going to skip a few slides. Our next type of tissue is connective tissue. Now remember, we have labs on all of these tissue types, so we're not spending an awful lot of time on this in our lecture notes. Connective tissues are found throughout the body. They're the most abundant and widely distributed primary tissues. The categories of connective tissue are connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Right? Most people probably wouldn't realize that blood is a connective tissue. This tells us where all of the connective tissues come from embryonically. So actually they all come from a single layer called the mesenchyme. So all of our tissues, connective tissue proper, cartilage, the connective tissue proper, cartilage, osseous or bone tissue, and blood all come from the same original tissue called mesenchyme. This would be the original stem cell for connective tissues. The functions of connective tissues: binding and support, protection, insulation, and transportation. Of course, transportation would be, for the most part, the blood. Connective tissues have mesenchyme as their common tissue origin. They have varying degrees of vascularity or blood supply, and they have non-living extracellular matrix consisting of ground substance and fibers. Ground substance is unstructured material that fills the space between cells. Right? In other words, this is not part of the living material. Fibers are proteins like collagen, elastic fibers, or reticular fibers. And the cells are varying kinds depending on the type of connective tissue. Some of them are fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts, and hematopoietic stem cells in the case of blood. Ground substance is interstitial fluid. That's the fluid in the spaces in between cells. It's composed of adhesion proteins, proteoglycans, which we're not really too concerned about those right now, and it functions as a molecular sieve through which nutrients diffuse between blood capillaries and cells. So the blood actually doesn't travel into the tissues, it stays in the blood vessels, down to the smallest ones, the blood capillaries. And the ground substance of connective tissue has to be able to allow the fluid from the blood, the plasma, to actually diffuse through to the cells. The fibers that we're going to find in connective tissue are basically three kinds. Collagen fibers, they're tough fibers and provide high tensile strength. Elastic fibers that are long, thin fibers and allow for stretch and recoil or rebound. And reticular fibers that are branched collagenous fibers that form delicate networks. This is sort of a spider web kind of appearance. The cells, we have fibroblasts that are in the connective tissue proper. They manufacture fibers. Chondroblasts in cartilage, and they actually manufacture the matrix for cartilage. Osteoblasts in bone, and osteoblasts manufacture the matrix, once again, for bone. And hematopoietic stem cells that are the blood-producing cells. We also find in the matrix white blood cells, plasma cells, macrophages, and mast cells. These are all immune system cells that have the job of protecting the cells and tissues from invaders. As we talked about earlier, all connective tissue comes from mesenchyme embryonically. Mesenchyme has a gel-like ground substance with fibers and star-shaped mesenchymal cells. It gives rise to all other connective tissues and is found in the embryo. This is the original, one of the original kinds of stem cells. And here we see mesenchyme. You can see the cells are very sparse, and the ground substance is mostly fluid or space. The connective tissue proper is most of the connective tissue of the body. First, we're going to look at loose connective tissue. And the first kind of loose connective tissue is areolar or areolar. I've heard it pronounced both ways over the years. Areolar connective tissue. It has a gel-like matrix with all three connective tissue fibers. It has fibroblasts, macrophages, mast cells, and some white blood cells in it. And it wraps and cushions organs. It's widely distributed throughout the body. And here's a microscope slide showing areolar connective tissue, which is loose connective tissue. You can see the elastic fibers up in here, the darkly colored kind of thin fibers. And you can see collagen fibers all through this area. Nice big thick collagen protein fibers. The next kind of loose connective tissue is adipose connective tissue, commonly known as fat tissue. The matrix is similar to areolar connective tissue with closely packed adipocytes. Adipocytes are the fat cells. They serve as reserves for food stores. In other words, they store energy in the form of fat. They insulate against heat loss and support and protect the surrounding tissues. They're found under the skin, around the kidneys, within the abdomen, and in the breasts. Local fat deposits serve nutrient needs of highly active organs. Right, so organs can draw upon the energy stored in fat deposits. This is a kind of picture that you probably will never see of adipose tissue, but you might see it on the lab test. All right, this is a very clear view of the cells, and you see we see a lot of space in the cells because that is where the fat is stored. The oil is stored in there. All right, the cytoplasm of the cell is kind of squashed up against the cell membrane, and also you can see the nuclei here kind of squashed up against the membrane. So these areas in between that are all white are areas where the fat deposits are stored. Next kind of connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. It has a loose ground substance with reticular fibers. Reticular cells lie in a fiber network. It forms a soft internal skeleton or stroma that supports other cell types. It's found in lymph nodes, bone marrow, and the spleen. It sort of acts as a filtration system. And this is reticular connective tissue. You can see fairly densely packed cells compared to other loose connective tissues, and we do see reticular fibers that form this matrix, sort of a web-like structure. We also are seeing mast cells in here, which are the immune system cells that are being sort of stored or housed in the reticular connective tissue. The next type of connective tissue proper is dense regular connective tissue. It has parallel collagen fibers with a few elastic fibers interspersed. The major cell type is a fibroblast. Excuse me. It attaches muscles to bone or to other muscles and bone to bone. It's found in tendons, ligaments, and aponeuroses, which are broad tendon-like structures in certain areas of the body. Here we see dense regular connective tissue. Notice the collagen fibers are all in nice parallel lines. See if I can draw parallel lines there. All right, these are densely packed collagen fibers. You can see a nucleus every once in a while in here, a few nuclei. It's easy to mistake this with smooth muscle tissue, so be careful on that. All right, dense regular connective tissue attaches to muscles or bones, so we find this in tendons and ligaments. Next type is dense irregular connective tissue. Irregularly arranged collagen fibers with some elastic fibers. The major cell type is the fibroblast. It withstands tension in many directions, providing structural strength. It's found in the dermis, the submucosa of the digestive tract, and fibrous organ capsules. Here we see the dense irregular connective tissue. You can see the collagen fibers are not parallel as they were in dense regular connective tissue. They look more scrambled or in a sort of network instead of in parallel lines. All right, this type of connective tissue withstands tension and is exerted in many directions, or tensile strength, basically. The next kind of connective tissue is cartilage, and we're going to look first at hyaline cartilage. It's amorphous. In other words, it doesn't have a really defined look or matrix to it. It has a firm matrix with imperceptible networks of collagen fibers. Chondrocytes lie in lacuna, or small spaces in the matrix. It supports, reinforces, cushions, and resists compression. It forms the costal cartilages, and it's found in the embryonic skeleton and the end of long bones, the nose, the trachea, and the larynx. Here's our hyaline cartilage. Many times we'll see slides of this and it looks a little more pink than this, but the basic look is the same. It's often likened to Swiss cheese. So we see the cheese here, which is the matrix, and we see the lacunae, which are these spaces in the matrix where the cells live. Right? These are chondrocytes living in the lacuna. Elastic cartilage is similar to hyaline cartilage, but with more elastic fibers. It maintains its shape and structure while allowing flexibility. It supports the external ear, or the pinna, and the epiglottis, which we find in the throat. Elastic cartilage looks something like this. We see a lot of elastic fibers in it, very densely packed elastic fibers all in this area. Here we see lacuna, and in the lacuna we have the living cells, or chondrocytes. Fibrocartilage is another type of cartilage. The matrix is similar to hyaline cartilage, but less firm with thick collagen fibers. It provides tensile strength and absorbs compression shock. It is found in the intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, the joint between the two pubic bones, and the discs of the knee joint. Fibrocartilage looks like this. We can see the collagen fibers, not as densely packed as we would see in dense regular connective tissue. And we also see the chondrocytes living in lacuna here. And the major place we find this is in the intervertebral discs. It has good tensile strength, and absorbs pretty well. It absorbs compressive shocks, but it doesn't absorb lateral loading forces very well. That's why the discs are prone to injuries with lateral loading forces. Next we have bone, or osseous tissue. Bone is the hardest connective tissue. It has a calcified matrix with collagen fibers found in the bone. Osteocytes, or bone cells, are found in lacuna and are well vascularized. It supports, protects, and provides levers for muscular action. It also serves as a storehouse for calcium and other minerals and fat. Marrow inside bones is the site of hematopoiesis, or blood cell formation. Bone has a very distinctive look, especially because when they make bone slides, what they do is they cut the bone with an instrument sort of like a saw, and make very thin slices of bone tissue, and then they dye it with India ink. So we get this characteristic kind of brown and black look to the slide, instead of pink or purple like most cell slides are, right? So here we see osteocytes that are living in the lacuna. So all of these round and oval shaped areas that have a black dot in them are lacuna with osteocytes. We see the central canal here, and we can see the little canals that are running out from the central canal, which are called canaliculi. They're all over in here, all right? And of course, you're looking at all of these slides of tissues in lab also. Last type of connective tissue is blood. I'm not going to study blood in Bio 201 because there's a whole unit on that in Bio 202. The matrix of blood is red and white cells found in a plasma matrix. Blood is totally contained within blood vessels and functions in the transport of respiratory gases, nutrients, and wastes. So a slide of blood will look something like this. We can see red blood cells here and different kinds of white blood cells. We have a neutrophil here and a lymphocyte here. This is a platelet right in there. The little tiny thing is a platelet. Next, we're going to take a look at membranes. In a membrane, we find membranes in various areas in the body. The skin is called actually the cutaneous membrane. And in case you didn't know where the skin is, here's a diagram to show you. Epithelial membranes, we have mucous membranes that line the body cavities open to the exterior. In other words, that would be in the digestive tract and the respiratory tract. Most people don't think about the digestive tract being open to the exterior, but it is, because we have an opening at the mouth and it goes all the way through the digestive tract and comes out the anus. Serous membranes are moist membranes found in closed ventral body cavities. So around the organs in the abdomen, we have a double membrane, actually. We have what's known as a parietal peritoneum, which is the part of the membrane that lines the cavity of the abdomen. And then we have what's known as the visceral peritoneum, and visceral means organs. It pertains to organs. So the visceral peritoneum surrounds all of the organs in the abdomen. If we move up into the chest cavity, we can then see another set of membranes, and we have one called the parietal pleura, which lines the cavities that the lungs are in, the pleural cavities. And we have the visceral pleura, which adheres to the surface of the lungs. Maybe if I change to a different color here, we can see that better. Right? So we have a double layer membrane called parietal pleura and visceral pleura. And same thing goes for the heart. We have the parietal pericardium, which is lining the cavity that the heart is in, and we have the visceral pericardium, which actually adheres to the heart tissue. Next, we have nervous tissue. We have branch neurons with long cellular processes and support cells. The job of the nervous system is to transmit electrical signals from sensory receptors to effectors. Nervous tissue is found in the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. And we're going to talk a lot more about nerve tissue in a later unit. It's going to look something like this. The neurons are these large cells. You can see the nucleus is kind of a pale-looking space with a sort of darker nucleolus in it. And each one of these neuron cells has appendages that come off of it, or fibers. And those are nerve fibers, or neuron processes. So we have a cell body and multiple processes coming out of the neuron. There are also support cells in the nervous system. So most of these little brown dots that you see on this slide, like in here and in here, those are nuclei of the support cells. Muscle tissue. There's three types of muscle tissue. The first one is skeletal. Skeletal muscle cells are long and cylindrical and multinucleate. They have multiple nuclei with obvious striations. Now, striations are dark and light colored lines that are running across the cells. Skeletal muscle initiates and controls voluntary movement. They are voluntary. That means you can control them with your conscious mind. They're found in skeletal muscles that attach to bones or skin. Most skeletal muscles attach to bones. Skeletal muscle tissue has a very obvious look to it. If you see it on a good slide, and this would be a good picture, I would try to give you a good picture like this on a test. You can see the striations on it. Let me get back to green here. All of these lines that are going in this direction are striations. The cells run in parallel lines. Each one of these is a cell, and you can see multiple nuclei in one cell, and that's because muscle cells are very long. If we take any muscle of the body, each cell of the muscle runs the whole length of the muscle. Here we can see, I believe we're looking at a triceps muscle in here, over in the left-hand side of the slide, and the length of it is from the shoulder down to the elbow. Every cell of the muscle is that long, even though they're not visible to the naked eye. They're microscopic, but they are that long. So they need multiple nuclei to carry out the instructions for making proteins. Next type of muscle is cardiac. We only find cardiac muscle in the walls of the heart. The cells are branching, striated, and only have one nucleus. They're interlocking cells at intercalated discs. If you imagine the heart, it's not attached, the muscle of the heart is not attached to anything except itself, right? So the cells are interlocking, and they actually pull on each other or contract on each other. The job of the cardiac muscle is to propel blood into the circulation. And like I said, only found in the walls of the heart. Cardiac muscle, once again, a very distinctive look. Obvious striations again on the cells. And every once in a while, we can see a nucleus in the cell. Not very many nuclei visible in here, but we're also seeing these lines that run perpendicular to the long axis of the cell, and those are called intercalated discs. There's another nucleus in here, one over here. All right. Smooth muscle are found in sheets of spindle-shaped cells with central nuclei that have no striations. All right, so no striations on smooth muscle cells. The job of smooth muscle is to propel substances along internal passageways. In the digestive system, we call that peristalsis. It's found in the walls of hollow organs, including blood vessels. Smooth muscle looks something like this. Notice it does look very similar to dense regular connective tissue. I think the thing that would distinguish it is that the cells are spindle-shaped, right? So we do see some tapering of cells in here, and we have pretty obvious central nuclei in the cells. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about tissue trauma. One of the characteristic signs of trauma to tissue is inflammation. It's characterized by dilation of the blood vessels, opening up of the blood vessels to let more fluid flow into the damaged area. an increase in vessel permeability, again, to allow more fluids to move into the area. And these are called the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation: redness, heat, swelling, and pain. All right, let's take a look at repairing this damaged tissue. So we had our cut down through the epidermis here and all the way into the dermis where we find the blood vessels, and some of the blood vessels were damaged, so blood leaked out to the surface, and that's going to clot, and then eventually the blood clot is replaced with granulation tissue, which is sort of the first stage to getting back to normal. Then we have regeneration and fibrosis. The surface epithelium regenerates, and on the next slide we'll see the scab, and that scab will detach. We can also see in here immune system cells, neutrophils and macrophages, which are in the area to clean it up, to ingest or digest bacteria and viruses and anything that gets into the wound. Then we see the scab, which is going to detach after a while, and regenerated epithelium. The epithelium is the first part of the tissue that gets back to a normal look. We see fibroblasts here that are cells that are going to lay down the fiber matrix that this tissue in the area in the dermis is going to be rebuilt upon. The fibrous tissue matures and begins to resemble the adjacent tissue in this area. We also see capillaries rebuilding for the blood supply in this area, right in here, like that. So we end up with a fully regenerated epithelium in this area. It looks just like it did before the injury. Under that, though, we will have some underlying scar tissue, which is called fibrosis, and it is an area where there are a lot of collagen fibers laid down, and you can see the cells here producing the fiber area, and there's normal tissue being built within that matrix. Developmental aspects of these tissues: the primary germ layers, or layers that these tissues come from embryologically, are ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. They are 3 layers of cells formed early in embryonic development. They specialize to form the 4 primary tissues. Nerve tissue arises from ectoderm. Muscle and connective tissue and endothelium and mesothelium arise from the mesoderm. And most mucosa arise from endoderm. Epithelial tissues arise from all 3 germ layers. Here we see the 3 germ layers: ectoderm in blue, mesoderm in red, and endoderm in yellow. Epithelium comes from all 3 layers. Nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm up in here, and muscle and connective tissue mostly from the mesoderm in the middle. And that's the last of our slides on tissues.